On March 27, 1908, the New York Tribune printed two banking stories on the same front page. Near the center, in enormous type, "Knickerbocker opens, deposits $2 million." Near the bottom right, "Bomb near Pati Bank, shakes up tenement house, tenants in a panic." The second bomb had not exploded inside Pati's bank. It went off in the hallway of 246 Elizabeth Street, beside another banker's office, and 6 street numbers from Pati's already closed bank at 240. That qualification matters. So does the fact that the newspaper used Pati's name to identify the entire scene. By then, his bank was famous. It had been bombed 2 months earlier. An armed man had entered and threatened his family. Pati had shot him. Then Pati disappeared, the bank closed, and depositors filled Elizabeth Street. On the day the Tribune covered the new explosion, a very different crowd stood outside Knickerbocker Trust on Fifth Avenue. There were flowers on the officers' desks. The state superintendent of banks stood in the rotunda and formally declared the institution open. Large companies deposited hundreds of thousands of dollars. A tailor presented the first check at the paying window and chose not to take the cash. One front page, 2 banks, a ceremony and a bomb. They were not part of one plot. Knickerbocker did not cause the violence on Elizabeth Street, but their placement on the same sheet of paper reveals something that a clean financial timeline can hide. In New York, after the panic of 1907, confidence was not distributed equally. One institution could rebuild it with capital, contracts, powerful depositors, and a public ceremony. Another built it through a man behind a counter, money in a window, iron bars, family ties, and the promise that earnings placed in New York would reach someone in Italy. Both systems failed. Only one had the machinery to return. To understand why, we have to begin 5 months earlier, when Knickerbocker became the name of the panic itself. Knickerbocker was not a small neighborhood bank. By deposits, the Tribune called it the second largest trust company in the country. A trust company looked enough like a bank to an ordinary depositor. It accepted money, it made loans, it invested. But in 1907, New York's trusts stood partly outside the protective arrangements built around national banks. They held lower cash reserves. They were not ordinary members of the New York Clearinghouse, and there was no Federal Reserve waiting to create emergency liquidity. There was no federal deposit insurance. If frightened depositors demanded cash at the same time, survival depended on what the institution could raise, what allies would provide, and how long confidence would hold. The clearinghouse was itself a confidence machine, but it was a private one. Member banks cleared claims against one another, examined members, and could create loan certificates during a crisis. The arrangement allowed a group of institutions to treat some risks collectively. Trust companies had grown rapidly outside much of that structure. They could invest more aggressively and operate with less cash in reserve. In ordinary times, that made them flexible and profitable. In a panic, it meant the public could demand money faster than a trust could convert its assets into currency. The distinction between solvent and liquid becomes crucial here. A solvent institution may own assets worth more than it owes. A liquid institution can still produce cash when depositors line up this morning. If the assets cannot be sold quickly without a ruinous loss, or if nobody will lend against them, a bank can fail the second test before anyone completes the first. That was the problem Benjamin Strong faced. The crowd did not need a final audit. It needed cash and an answer before the teller windows opened. In October 1907, a failed attempt to corner the stock of United Copper began pulling a chain of names into public suspicion. Knickerbocker's president, Charles T. Barney, was connected socially and financially to men involved in the speculation. The connection was enough. The trust's board forced Barney out. Its clearing agent, the National Bank of Commerce, stopped clearing for it. A request for support reached J.P. Morgan. Morgan asked Benjamin Strong to examine Knickerbocker's books. Strong would later become the first head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. But in October 1907, he was trying to answer the most urgent question in banking, with no public backstop and almost no time. Was Knickerbocker sound enough to save? He could not reach a firm answer before the cash ran out. Morgan declined to support the trust. The next morning, the line formed. The Tribune later described a run lasting only a few hours. About $7 million in cash left the institution. Then the doors closed. That closure made the rumor real. Depositors at other trust companies no longer had to imagine that a major institution could stop paying. They had watched it happen. The panic moved through New York's financial system. Credit tightened. Trust companies pulled back. The trouble reached firms that depended on short-term finance. Industrial output would fall sharply in the downturn that followed. But the Knickerbocker story did not end with liquidation. The trust was suspended, not erased. Its assets still existed. Its directors still had influence. Its creditors and depositors could still negotiate. If enough people agreed not to demand all their money at once, the institution might be given something no frightened bank can manufacture by itself: time. The rehabilitation plan divided claims into certificates and schedules. Most of the money would remain tied up, earning 3%. Another series earned 4%. A higher rate, sometimes repeated in later accounts, was not the ordinary promise. It was a conditional penalty if one series remained unpaid after a much longer deadline. This was not the simple restoration of unrestricted accounts. It was a contract for patience. The plan also required new capital. Federal Reserve history records an infusion of about $2.4 million. The certificates changed the timing of the promise. Before suspension, a depositor's claim was simple in theory: present the account and receive cash. After suspension, the institution could not honor every claim in that form at once. The rehabilitation plan converted immediate demands into scheduled obligations with interest. That conversion imposed a cost on depositors. They surrendered access to much of their own money. But the alternative could have been a long receivership, forced asset sales, and uncertain recovery. The agreement did not make the panic disappear. It made the panic slow enough to manage. This is why the reopening ceremony cannot be dismissed as decoration. A contract can delay a claim, but it cannot by itself stop a new run on the first day. The public still had to believe that enough other people would honor the same bargain. Knickerbocker's route back, then, was built from several kinds of power at once: directors who could organize, depositors who could be bound into a collective agreement, investors who could supply capital, lawyers who could turn delay into certificates, institutions large enough to signal confidence with visible deposits, and a state official prepared to stand in the building when the doors reopened. Knickerbocker still had to prove that the public would accept the arrangement. But first, cross Manhattan from Fifth Avenue to Elizabeth Street. There, the word bank described something more personal. Pasquale Pati and his son Salvatore operated at 240 Elizabeth Street, in the heart of New York's Italian neighborhood. Their business sold steamship and railroad tickets. It accepted deposits. It received money to be transmitted overseas. A customer could walk through the door with wages earned in America and ask the Patis to move the money toward a person or obligation in Italy. That service was not a side issue. Migration depended on financial connections that crossed an ocean. Workers sent earnings to parents, wives, children, creditors, and property at home. Contemporary accounts of immigrant banking counted tens of millions of dollars flowing to Italy through such channels. A remittance began as a local act. A laborer handed dollars to a person he could see. The banker then had to turn that payment into a chain of records, correspondence, exchange, and delivery abroad. The customer might receive a receipt in New York, but the real proof arrived only when somebody in Italy received the money. That delay created a special kind of trust. The depositor could not watch the transfer move. The family abroad could not inspect the New York counter. Both sides depended on intermediaries whose value came from knowing the community and the route. Steamship tickets strengthened the same relationship. The office did not merely store money. It helped people move, helped money follow them, and connected lives divided by the Atlantic. A customer might use the same name for a passage, a letter, a deposit, and a payment home. The private immigrant banker filled gaps that a marble institution might not. He spoke the customer's language. He knew the destinations. He could combine tickets, letters, remittances, deposits, and local credit behind one counter. His office belonged to the same streets as his customers. That familiarity could create trust faster than a distant corporation. It could also concentrate danger. At Knickerbocker, confidence rested on a legal entity, directors, assets, certificates, capital, and a network of powerful institutions. At Pati and Son, confidence became inseparable from Pasquale Pati himself. He understood that customers needed proof, so he put money in the window. The Tribune reported $40,000 in gold and bills on display behind heavy iron bars. Pati explained that the pile was there to impress local Italians with the bank's stability. It was an unusually literal balance sheet. The customer did not have to read a report or recognize a director's name. The cash was visible from the street. The bars said it was protected. The man behind the counter said it could be trusted. But the display also announced that money was present, and the bars announced that somebody expected trouble. On the evening of January 23, 1908, with pedestrians passing outside and Pati's son inside, a bomb exploded near the bank's front window. The glass shattered. The shock threw an 11-year-old boy to the ground. Coins and bills scattered. Salvatore Pati swept the money into a box and pushed it into the safe. An employee moved beside him to defend the place. Police and a fire company arrived from stations only a short distance away. The bomb had struck half a block from police headquarters. No bomber was identified. The newspaper reported neighborhood theories. Perhaps the device had been intended for another businessman nearby. Perhaps it came from someone jealous of Pati. People repeated that he had once received a demand for money. Pati himself denied that the event should automatically be attributed to the Black Hand. That phrase appeared constantly in newspapers of the period. Sometimes it described genuine extortion threats, marked with familiar symbols. Sometimes police and reporters used it as a broad label for violence involving Italians. It did not always identify one organization, one chain of command, or one proven motive. The careful statement is the one the evidence allows. Pati's bank was bombed. The attack was real. The bomber and motive were not established. The iron bars held. The bank stayed open. But visible cash and loaded revolvers were becoming part of the same financial system. On Saturday, March 7, Pati and Son was crowded. The Tribune said depositors had come to place their weekly earnings. Behind the counter were Pasquale Pati, his wife Rosina, their son Salvatore, and Pati's son-in-law Louis Cartier, who managed a branch post office inside the business. Then a man entered with a revolver. The newspaper identified him as Francesco Palatro, also known as Giuseppe Sapia. It reported that he threatened to kill the banker and his family. Since the January bomb, Pati had kept loaded revolvers near at hand. He and Cartier fired. Customers rushed for the door. Rosina Pati collapsed behind the counter. Detectives entered to find Pati standing over the wounded man with a smoking weapon. Palatro was taken to St. Vincent's Hospital. The report treated his connection to a wider extortion group as a police theory, not a completed prosecution. It also recorded his own statement that he had bought a pistol and gone to Pati's place. The immediate facts were already enough. A bank full of weekly wages had become the scene of an armed confrontation. The person expected to safeguard deposits had also become the person expected to defend the room. At Knickerbocker, a run revealed the absence of a lender of last resort. At Pati, violence revealed the absence of almost every layer between the institution and the man. Pati was owner, reputation, security system, family patriarch, and public guarantee. When a system depends on one person, a threat to the person becomes a threat to every account. For a short time, the shooting may have strengthened the story Pati told about himself. He had faced the danger, he had defended his family and the bank. A coroner's jury cleared him in the death of the armed man. But the threats continued, and fear moved faster than any legal finding. In late March, Pati left New York with his family. A notice appeared at the closed bank. Its language asked clients to remain calm and trustworthy. It said the banker had been obliged to leave to protect his existence and his family. It listed houses, life insurance, and a bond with the state of New York as proof that he would return. The promise was written in the vocabulary of personal assurance. Trust the man. Trust his property. Trust the bond. Trust that absence is temporary. Outside, the crowd did not trust it. The Evening World described Elizabeth Street packed from Houston to Prince. A run spread to another nearby institution. 50 police officers were placed in the area. The paper framed the closure as the victory of an organized gang over a millionaire banker. Pati, it said, had been driven into exile. That explanation fit the evidence visible on the street. His bank had been bombed. An armed man had threatened his family. He had left. The doors were closed. Depositors were desperate. But a newspaper written during a panic sees the event before it sees the accounting. The accounting would take years. For the moment, Pati was gone. His name remained. 2 days after the Elizabeth Street crowd photograph was dated, Knickerbocker Trust reopened. At noon on March 26th, State Superintendent of Banks, Clark Williams, walked to the center of the rotunda at the main office on Fifth Avenue and formally declared the institution open for business. It had been closed for 5 months and 3 days. The crowd was not enormous. The Tribune counted only about 20 people waiting at the paying teller's window. That small line was part of the success. A bank reopening after a panic did not want a spectacle of bodies pressing toward cash. It wanted order. It wanted the first transaction to look ordinary. Flowers covered the officers' desks. Directors stood as an improvised reception committee. Old employees returned. The building, the people, and the decoration all communicated continuity. Then a tailor named Nathan Rauch approached the paying teller. His check was for $221. Rauch had not accepted the restrictions agreed to by many other depositors. According to the Tribune, he could have taken the money in full. He did not. He had the check certified and said he would deposit it in his bank. That decision was worth more to the ceremony than the amount itself. A withdrawal proves that a bank can pay. A customer who is free to withdraw and chooses not to proves something else. He proves that payment may not be necessary. The first new deposit came from Nathan Harris, the editor of a trade paper. He placed $120 into the reopened institution and said he wanted to show confidence. Those were human-sized transactions. Behind them came institutional money. Pennsylvania Railroad deposited $300,000. General Electric deposited $200,000. City Trust Company of Boston added another $200,000 for New England depositors. By the end of the day, deposits totaled approximately $2.036 million. Withdrawals totaled approximately $1.536 million. The headline rounded the story into the phrase, "The thumbnail preserves." Deposits, $2 million. But the result had not been produced by Flowers. The flowers were the visible surface of a financial structure built during the 5 months of suspension. New capital absorbed risk. Depositor agreements delayed demands. Interest-bearing certificates converted inaccessible money into a scheduled claim. Large institutions supplied deposits that private individuals could see and newspapers could print. The state banking superintendent supplied official legitimacy. Each layer carried part of the burden. Nathan Rauch did not have to know the value of every asset in Knickerbocker's portfolio. He could observe that contracts existed, capital had arrived, directors had returned, the state had permitted reopening, companies were depositing money, and the teller could honor his check. Confidence became distributed evidence. That is what Pati's bank lacked. Its evidence had been concentrated in one window and one man. When the window broke and the man disappeared, the evidence disappeared with him. On the same evening that Knickerbocker reopened, another bomb exploded on Elizabeth Street. The address was 246. Pati and Son had operated at 240. The blast was in a tenement hallway adjoining the banking house of Dominic Ponamolo. It did little physical damage, but a small amount of damage can produce a large amount of fear when a neighborhood has already lived through bombs, threats, a shooting, a bank closure, and a run. The street filled. Tenants crowded onto fire escapes, their cries carried while patrolmen begged them not to jump. Officers ran through the building, trying to calm the occupants. On the 5th floor, patrolman Ferguson found Mrs. Pasquale Casadza hanging by her hands from the fire escape after losing her footing. That is the human fact hidden under the headline. The bomb did not have to destroy a bank to shake a financial community. Pati's closed office had already turned the block into a map of uncertainty. The newspaper could locate the new explosion by saying it was near his bank because readers already knew the name. The front page placed this report 3 columns from Knickerbocker's reopening. At one address, public confidence was being choreographed. At the other, police were stopping tenants from jumping off a building. The contrast is real, but it is not yet complete. It would be easy to turn the page into a simple morality play. The rich bank received flowers, the immigrant banker received bombs. Respectability was protected, the neighborhood was abandoned. There is truth in that unequal capacity for protection. But there is another document. It was written years later, after customers had tried to recover the money Pati and Son were supposed to send overseas. In 1919, the New York Court of Appeals described the business of Pasquale and Salvatore Pati. They had sold steamship and railroad tickets. They had accepted deposits, and they had received money for transmission to people and institutions in Italy. Under a 1907 state law, the parties had posted a bond of $15,000. The bond promised that money entrusted for foreign transmission would be held, sent, and properly accounted for. The later court record says that did not happen. Customers delivered funds for Italy. The parties failed to forward them. The court said the money was appropriated to their personal use. The amount exceeded $70,000. On or about March 23, 1908, the father and son absconded. They were adjudged involuntary bankrupts. The $15,000 bond was far smaller than the valid claims against it. That mismatch explains why the court case continued long after the newspaper crowds were gone. The bond did not restore each customer separately. It created one limited pool for many people who had suffered the same breach. Every claimant, therefore, depended on the others. If one person collected the entire penalty first, equally valid customers could receive nothing. The courts had to identify the claims and divide a sum that was inadequate from the beginning. The legal process transformed a neighborhood panic into lists, amounts, deadlines, and shares. That was a form of institutional protection, but it arrived after the money was missing and could not make the pool larger than the bond. The number on the bond also reveals the scale of the gap between regulation and reality. The state had required a guarantee for foreign remittances. The guarantee proved that lawmakers recognized the danger. But $15,000 could not cover a failure exceeding $70,000. This does not make the January bomb imaginary. It does not make the armed threat imaginary. It does not mean every contemporary report about intimidation was invented. It means the story refuses to divide cleanly into victim and villain. Pati could be targeted by violence and still misuse the trust placed in him. His customers could believe he was protecting them from threats and still discover that their money had not reached Italy. The private immigrant bank solved real problems. It crossed language, distance, and institutional exclusion. It converted a neighborhood relationship into a financial bridge across the Atlantic. But when the same person controlled the counter, the records, the remittance, the reputation, and the explanation, customers carried a concentrated risk. The bomb exposed the physical weakness of that system. The court case exposed its financial weakness. Knickerbocker had its own concentrated failures. Its president's associations helped trigger a run. Its lower reserves and position outside the clearinghouse network made the crisis worse. It closed when depositors needed cash. The difference was not that the large institution was virtuous. The difference was that its recovery could be separated from one person. Barney was removed. New capital could enter. Directors could negotiate. Depositor claims could become certificates. State officials could supervise. Corporate depositors could signal support. The institution could change the terms under which it operated and remain recognizably the same institution. Party and Son could not separate the bank from the parties. When they disappeared, what remained was a locked door, a crowd, a photograph, and a bond too small for the claims. That is the deeper contrast inside the front page. Not a good bank and a bad bank, two architectures of trust. One could distribute failure across contracts and institutions. The other placed it on the bodies of a family, its customers, and the tenants living above the street. Return to March 27, 1908. The page is still there. Knickerbocker opens, deposits $2 million. Bomb near Pati Bank. Tenants in a panic. The upper story celebrates recovery. The lower story records fear. Neither headline contains the entire truth. Knickerbocker had not simply opened the doors and restored every account to normal. Its recovery depended on new money, frozen claims, negotiated patience, and institutional support. Pati was not simply an honest neighborhood banker driven away by criminals. He had faced documented violence, and a later court found that he and his son had also diverted the remittances entrusted to them. Newspapers compress events because a front page has limited space. History sometimes becomes visible when we refuse to separate the compressed pieces too quickly. The two reports do not need a secret connection to belong in the same story. Their connection is the question they force us to ask. What makes a financial promise survive when the person who made it cannot? At Knickerbocker, the answer was a structure large enough to replace individual trust with shared evidence. Capital, law, certificates, directors, major depositors, and public authority. On Elizabeth Street, trust remained immediate and human. That made it accessible. It also made every threat personal and every disappearance catastrophic. Nathan Rauch's $221 check and Mrs. Casatz's hands on the fire escape belonged to the same page for a reason larger than editorial coincidence. One person was being invited to demonstrate that he no longer needed his cash. The other was trying not to fall. The panic of 1907 is often told through Wall Street, J.P. Morgan, clearinghouses, and the creation of the Federal Reserve. Those institutions matter, but the need for them is easiest to understand at the edge of the system, where confidence still had to be displayed in a shop window and defended with a revolver. The front page did not announce a theory of financial citizenship. It simply placed the evidence close enough to see. A ceremony in the center, a bomb near the corner, and between them, the machinery that determined which promises could outlive the people who made them. A front page is not the whole truth. Sometimes the space between its columns tells you where to look for it.